So my first question for you is the sort of the obvious one. What did the New Deal accomplish in the end? How do we, if we were doing a balance sheet, you talked about some of the limitations and you talked about some of the roles different programs played, Social Security, various, but how would you sort of sum up the larger effect that the New Deal had?
I would say a few different things. One, and I know our mutual friend, Professor Rauchway likes to point this out all of the time. It's part of the conventional wisdom that the New Deal was a failure. That seems to be sort of the thing that everyone likes to say. The New Deal didn't end the Depression. It was World War II that ended the Depression. And I know you're going to have a lecture about World War II, and you will hear about the declining rates of unemployment. However, as our friend Professor Rauchway points out, the New Deal actually made a lot of progress. And too often we skip over that. And the way that we know it was working is because, first of all, we can see how Americans responded to we have the numbers, right? So, I mean, unemployment fell by about 15% over the course of the New Deal. So that was something, given where it was starting from, and we know how people were responding too. That is, it was making a tangible difference in their lives too, and that was clear from the midterm elections of 1934, which led to the Democrats having an even greater majority in Congress, which never happened for the party of the president. And then, of course, Roosevelt was reelected not only in 1936, but then again in 40 and 44. And so I would say that leads to really the second thing, which is the sort of creation of a new sort of sense that some would call it a sense of entitlement, a new sense that as an American citizen, you had a right to basic economic essentials. And I would say that that is a really significant, pivotal, transforming aspect of the New Deal, one that Roosevelt himself referred to as an economic bill of rights in his January 1944 State of the Union address.
So Meg, do you think it's fair to say that Roosevelt followed through on his commitment to help the forgotten man, and we should now say the forgotten person or forgotten citizen? Is that fair?
I think it's very fair. You know, I just talked a minute ago about this, how all citizens had this right, perceived right to basic things like a job. We see that we see that very clearly in the support that the Democratic Party, which aligned itself with these various policies, the support that the Democratic Party had for generations to come. And so I don't think that that was delusional. I think that that was based on tangible benefits that people received. And I should say this too, because I think I skipped over this. You know, when Roosevelt finally gets behind the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act, you know, and this was true even years earlier. He had always been a supporter of organized labor, even if he wasn't quite sure what the right sort of policy should be. You know, he sees the significance of the Wagner Act, not just for its ability to sustain demand, but really to provide dignity to the average worker.
What about some of the industrial elements of this, right? What would we say about the TVA? I mean, again, you had a limited amount of time in your lecture, but I think it's really important. And there are a lot of scholars who have been saying a lot about economic development, modernization theory. Is there an element of this that you think is important to understand?
I think for sure. I mean, I think, and I said this, but I said a lot of things. You and I, Jeremy, are New Yorkers, so that means we talk really fast, which helps when you're trying to get a lot in a short period of time.
Right.
Let me just repeat this. I mean, really what you see with TVA, with the WPA, with the PWA, with these sort of large building programs, you see what another of our colleagues calls a public works revolution, really the sort of building of an infrastructure that in no way, shape, or form existed before. And what's significant about that is not just the sort of allegiance that it builds for Americans towards the Democratic Party, but really what's significant is the way in which it lays the basis for economic growth for decades to come.
Right. I think that's really crucial. And so it becomes part of the built environment of the United States, right?
Exactly.
Great. So we have a number of superb questions from teachers here. Daniel Simpson asks, what role, you mentioned this a bit, you talked about race a bit already. I think Daniel would like to hear more about the role of race in the New Deal and the attempts by FDR to shore up African-American support. So the politics of race, as well as the consequences of the New Deal for race, the race relations in the United States and the experiences of African-Americans and other vulnerable groups.
I think that's a great question and a really important question. You know, I mean, Roosevelt was, part of the reason Roosevelt was successful is that he was a successful politician, which doesn't excuse the limitations of the New Deal, but does help to explain them. That is to say, as much as he wanted to pass meaningful reforms for the average working man, he understood that he had to structure legislation in a way that would win support. And what that meant was Southern Democrats who had seniority on all of the important committees, comprised a large percentage of the Democrats in Congress throughout this whole period. What it meant was all of his programs had to pass muster. Now, to go back to the previous question, they were quite happy, Southern Democrats, to take funds like the TVA that led to economic development. They were less okay, in fact, they weren't okay with supporting programs that would disrupt the social order, the racial hierarchy of the Jim Crow South. And so that meant not empowering African-American workers by and large. And Roosevelt knew what he was doing. This is not like we should only look now and looking back now, fault him. He knew what he was doing.
Right.
And so the question is, how do you sort of evaluate and score him on the question of civil rights? Now, it is true that many of the large programs like the WPA gave disproportionate jobs to African Americans in certain northern cities, for example, and Roosevelt, with Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a big champion, a very vocal champion of civil rights, understood that that ultimately you would need to engage in the question of civil rights. He just didn't think he had the political capital to do it.
Right. So some of his programs certainly empowered African Americans and other groups, women, immigrants, but there was also a deal with the devil in a sense, right? To take on and reaffirm, particularly the position of many conservative Democrats, and affirming Jim Crow, right?
Correct.
And that's a really important point. My students are always shocked that lynchings continued, but they did.
Yes.
They did during this period.
So, so you have an interesting moment, for example, in 1937, 1938, with an anti-lynching bill, a federal anti-lynching bill. And FDR does not put his support behind it. He doesn't speak against it, but he doesn't come out in favor of it. On the other hand, during the what was it, 8-week filibuster or something by the Southern Democrats, Eleanor Roosevelt sat in the galleries of the Senate, making clear what her position was.
Right, right. But it's a really important point that the first Democrat to firmly embrace anti-lynching legislation is Lyndon Johnson. It's really interesting point. Okay, so let's see. Anthony Gallos asked about the New Deal and the concerns or the arguments that are made about the New Deal not being responsible for the economic recovery. I think you've addressed that already, Anthony. Let us know if there's part of that we've missed. Brian asks, do you feel that the reason there wasn't such public unrest during the early days of the Depression was the attitude of most Americans? Why wasn't there more unrest? Why wasn't there this uprising of the working class that Marx and others had predicted?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a good point. I think, to just elaborate on what I said before, the sense that in 1883, William Graham Sumner, famous Yale sociologist, wrote, "What do social classes owe each other?" And the short answer was nothing. That was the short answer. So we could sort of think of this whole era that came before the New Deal, and we shouldn't simplify because we want all of our teachers to have nuanced sort of understandings. But by and large, that there was a sort of laissez-faire that you were sort of left to your own devices if you found yourself down and out. And I offered a bit of a stylized portrait because what you start to see slowly is this sort of, out of desperation, Americans becoming angrier and angrier and sort of protesting more and more. And so that by the time you have the Bonus Army March, there had already been protests before that, initially starting with that were sort of communist led, and we should say that there were only about 7,500 communists in the whole country at the time, but nevertheless the fact that they could recruit tens of thousands of people to their rallies and protests signified that the country was really suffering and starting to move beyond this notion of self-reliance.
Gotcha. Great. So we have two more questions. One I think didn't show up in the chat for everyone. This is from Teresa Russo. She asked, it's a really good question. In the lead up to the New Deal, in the moment and the economic shifts that caused the Great Depression, to what extent did consumer goods and the flood of manufactured goods to consumers, did those create an inflated market? Is there a story of sort of an inflationary market that precedes the Great Depression? Or in other terms, how should we talk to students about, I know my students, even at the university level, often ask these questions, Meg. How could you have this story of hyperinflation in Germany and then deflation during the Great Depression? Yeah. How does that, what's the relationship there? I know it's a big question, but.
Yeah, it's multiple questions. Let me think how I want to answer that. I mean, the short answer is you had inflation and deflation going on at the same time, which was sort of complicated, which is to say prices were, you had unemployment, but prices were not falling as fast as everything else. So relatively speaking, goods were costing more at a moment when people were earning less. That's one answer. But even going back a little bit, I'll just expand upon something I said, which is, you had an increasing, I mean, the 1920s was marked by extraordinary growth, economic growth. So the shortest way to say this, and I think this always resonates with students, is that GNP doubled between 1920 and 1929, something like that, with the same number of workers, because all of the teachers, and you will know that, of course, we closed down our borders after World War I, so we have largely the same number of workers turning out twice as many goods. So, by and large, the price of goods was coming down because that was sort of the model. Turn out as many as you can, have a smaller profit margin. But again, not enough to the point where the vast majority of Americans could afford them. So the average income was, by the end of the decade, was like $725, right? And to put that in context, a radio costs $75.
Right. That's really helpful. That's a really good example. I hadn't heard that one before. Okay, last question. And Sam is telling us we have 1 minute, but I know since we're both New Yorkers, we'll get through the question fast and your answer. Fast, Daniel.
About environmental history.
Right, about environmental history. Go for it.
Yeah. So that's quite right. You know, as much as we celebrate the TVA for these fabulous dams that delivered cheap power and electricity, you know, we now know, and this is in contrast because this was not known at the time, we now know that this led to the erosion of things like biodiversity and had sort of all of these negative environmental consequences. I will say, though, that it is wrong to not see FDR as an environmentalist. He really was an environmentalist. He was, you know, he spent his formative sort of years in Hyde Park. He really sort of was a man of the land. That's what he saw himself as. He was like completely interested in soil conservation and soil preservation. And that's why the first program to get passed is the CCC, because that really was close to his heart of things that he cared about. It's just that we now know different things than they knew at the time.
Right, right. And there are a number of important books on the environment and the New Deal. I'm just going to put one quickly. This is just one that I like, actually by a student of Liz Cohen's, Neil Maher, Nature's New Deal. For those who are interested, I know a lot of students are interested in environmental issues now. So I just put that in the chat, and we can give you other references as well. I know Meg probably knows tons of books on this as well.